I am very happy to welcome you all today here. And I would like to thank our home institutions for making it possible for all of this to happen, and also our funding agencies. I'm Nara Figueiredo. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Campinas at the Center of Logic, Epistemology, and History of Science. Hi, Inês. Good to see you.
Hi. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for organizing, Nara.
Thank you as well. César is a professor at the Federal University of ABC. He works with philosophy of mind and language. We have also here Luis, who's kindly agreed to help us out. He is a PhD student in biochemistry at the University of São Paulo. And I would like to welcome our invited participants. Hayden is our keynote speaker. He's a Canadian philosopher, instructor at the University of Windsor. And from January on, he will be working as a postdoctoral researcher for the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science in Hokkaido, Japan. That's very exciting. Inês is a postdoctoral researcher at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain, and she works in the intersection between philosophy of mind and computational cognitive science. And Julian is a professor of neurophilosophy at the University of Amsterdam. In his research, he pursues the confluence between phenomenology and cognitive science. Hayden is going to talk today with us about his research on how meaning extend in language from more basic bodily modes of sense making in perception, action, and pre-verbal communication. And he's going to present for 45 minutes. Afterwards, we're going to have a short break of 5 minutes. We're going to welcome comments from Inês, and then from Julian, and afterwards we're going to open for Q&As. Thank you all. Hayden, please be welcome.
Thank you so much, Nara, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. Thanks for the organization, to Nara and César, and to Inês and Julian for taking the time to comment on my work. I feel really privileged and honored to have you guys commenting on my work, so thank you so much for that. Okay, so I'll go over to my slides and you guys let me know if that's coming through okay.
All fine, thank you.
Good, okay, great. Okay, so the topic of my talk today is Horizons of the Word. You'll understand very briefly why it's titled that and the kind of specific sense in which I'm using the term horizon. The nice thing about giving a talk on horizons is all of the graphics select themselves. So you'll get quite tired of seeing images of horizons shortly, I assure you. So just a little bit of background. In fact, before I get to horizons, the kind of guiding idea or a background idea of this, this line of research that I'm introducing here comes from a very old analogy that we find coming up time and time again in the history of reflection on language. And it's a suggestion that there might be some very similar characteristics, or at least a profound analogy, between words and tools. That a word is in some respects like a tool. What can we get out of that? So this goes back as far as ancient philosophy. Plato, in his famous dialogue, The Cratylus, explores this analogy. Socrates suggests somewhat cryptically that a name is a tool for instructing by separating being. It occurs through the history of linguistics, and in more recent time, it's associated with Wittgenstein, who in his later thought experimented with this analogy as well, of thinking about words or language more generally as having a kind of tool characteristic. And it comes up also in my phenomenological tradition, in the work of Merleau-Ponty, who floats this, this comparison in a few different places. But I think for the most part, most of the thinkers who've entertained the suggestion have seen this to be primarily an analogy or a kind of heuristic way of getting us to think about some property or characteristic of language or another, but haven't really driven the comparison too far. And what I'd like to do today is to explore just to what extent we can take this comparison really seriously and actually say that there might be some properties of language or of words specifically that are very much the same, or at least deeply continuous with properties of perceived objects more generally. But specifically, I think tools give us a great way of thinking about this comparison. So my objectives for today are, I'm going to develop the concept of a horizon to provide a descriptive phenomenology, a first-person description of the experience of how we perceive, process, and interact with language, specifically tools. And this is going to, or specifically words, pardon me. And this is going to be based in the phenomenology of experiencing objects, tools in particular. I'm going to explore some correlations between the phenomenology of language experience that I develop and the underlying neurological correlates of language processing. So we'll have both components, a first-person descriptive component, and then I'll also see if we can find loosely some correlation in what's going on the neurological level with language. And then I'm hoping that this is going to make a contribution to 4E accounts of language. So approaches in 4E cognitive science that elaborate the enactive, embodied, embedded, and extended nature of cognition. And specifically, these approaches have been presented with what's called the scaling up problem. So some critics say, okay, 4E approaches in cognitive science do an okay or even a very good job of dealing with cases of cognition like perception and action, where we're directly encountering the world. But they worry that they won't be able to deal with cases of higher order cognition, like thought, imagination, memory, and language. And I propose that my account is going to give us a way to respond to that concern. But I'll elaborate that problematic in greater detail later. Now, a word about my approach. The background for this horizon concept that I'm going to elaborate for you comes primarily from the phenomenological tradition. It has an earlier anticipation in the work of William James, but specifically what I'm going to draw on is the work of Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and Grovitch. But for present purposes, my approach is what we might call phenomenology light. I'm going to draw from those resources, but I'm going to try to deliver the concept of a horizon to you in a way that would be acceptable for anyone who's interested in just describing the experiential first-person character of consciousness in general. So it doesn't need any specific commitment to the phenomenological tradition. And I know some of my friends in phenomenology will not be very comfortable with this approach and say, hey, you shouldn't do phenomenology light. But for our present purposes, it's going to be okay. I have some stronger phenomenological commitments elsewhere, but they're not relevant for today's presentation. And I'll try as best I can to integrate those first-person descriptions with the empirical research on mind and language, specifically from neuro and behavioral linguistics. The work I'm presenting today has appeared recently in Phenomenology and the Cognitive Sciences. So I'll be covering a lot of the territory that's available in that paper. And then I'm going to point to some of the directions that I'm hoping I'll be able to continue this, this research project. Okay, so just a quick preview here. First, I'm going to break down the concept of horizon and illustrate it with the case of perceiving and interacting with a thing or a tool. Then I'll discuss how this might apply to understanding words, how we perceive and process language. I'll move on to talk about some continuities between perception and action on the one hand with tools, and how this might shift over to words and language more generally, trying to begin a response to that scaling up problem of understanding how there can be a continuity between typically lower orders of cognition, like perception and action, and a higher order cognition, like what we get with language. Okay, so first, horizons of the tool. Here's a first kind of determination, a bit of a formal understanding of this concept of the horizon. And I'm going to cash that out with a much more concrete illustration as we advance. But roughly, the horizons of an experienced object are, and I have my trusty hockey stick with me by way of illustration. A very loose definition, it's something like the networks of typical habitual associations that inform our experience of and interaction with a particular object, and that prefigure further continuations of experience and interaction with it. So taking my example of the hockey stick, when I perceive the hockey stick, I get a lot more that comes with my experience and perception of that. There are a lot of associations that I have based on past interactions, the ways that I've engaged with this object before, and this shaped the way I perceive it in the present moment of experience, and it also outlines kind of further possibilities and continuations of experience that I'm likely to have with this kind of object. Now, this is a structural feature of all conscious experience. I'm going to illustrate it using the case of object perception, because that's the most obvious and the case that's been explored the most by phenomenologists. But these kind of analyses should transfer structurally, as it were, to other aspects of cognition, as I'll try to do with language. The specific horizons that we have for perceiving any object are based on a past learning history or past encounters and interactions with this type of object. And importantly, these associations are multimodal. And I mean multimodal not just in that they involve the various different perceptual modalities, such as touch and sight and audition, etc. But also that it goes beyond just perception. It involves action as well. It can involve affective dimensions of experience. It can incorporate memory and, as I'll suggest, higher orders of cognition like thought and imagination as well. Okay, so there are three moments of horizonality, as I'll describe it. And I'll just move through these briefly. There are a couple that are of primary concern for us. The first is typification. I'll explain that in a moment. The second is an inner horizon, non-relational properties or characteristics of the perceived object. And then there's the outer horizon, which is what I'm primarily going to be interested in today. And specifically, the outer horizon can be understood in terms of actual, empty, and within the empty, I'll distinguish between spatiotemporal and practical dimensions. Okay, that's a lot right off the bat, but I think as I work through those different moments of horizonality, it'll become clear what each of those means. So first, typification. A type, as I'm discussing it here, is just something like a loose, perception-based proto-category. And it's based on frequently occurring characteristics of this individual or the type or kind to which it belongs. And these are based on resemblance to an exemplar. Okay, we're on to dogs because I couldn't find this image with hockey sticks, as you can imagine. But when I perceive an individual dog, it's going to trigger associations that belong to the kind or the type to which I've ascribed that individual object or thing. And my expectations for ongoing experience with it are going to be prefigured by my kind of assumptions about dogs in general. So this is already operative even in just fleeting perception. So if I'm walking down the street and I see across from me a dog coming my way, I don't have to do a lot of kind of cognitive work, especially not consciously at least, to kind of classify that thing and to develop expectations about how it's going to act as my ongoing experience with it unfolds. So if it barks, that might not be a surprise. If it were to meow, that might catch me off guard because I've applied my type. I expect a certain continuation of experience. And again, these are formed through my past involvements with this thing or kinds of things and shapes my future expectations. So that's this first kind of lowest level of forming associations and expectations with an object that I'm perceiving or interacting with. Now we can also discuss what's called an inner horizon. I won't spend too much time on this because it's not especially important for our purposes, but the inner horizon would be further non-relational features of the object perceived that I can explore and bring into focus. For example, on my first fleeting perception, I might not have taken in the specific form, the color, the material, the weight, And there are other perspectives on the thing that I could take if I move around it or if it changes its position. We'll say these belong to the inner horizon because they're determinations or characteristics of that object itself, not relationally construed. And these features can be made salient through explication, which is just a redirection of my focal attention in one form or another. My real interest for today is the outer horizon. And the outer horizons concern relational determinations of the object. So for example, with my hockey stick, I might say it's in the corner of my office, behind the door. So these are kind of spatial relations that this object enters into. Or I could compare it to other sticks, to a specific other stick, or to hockey sticks in general, and state that this stick is comparatively heavy. Now, in these relational characteristics, we can distinguish between an actual and an empty outer horizon. The actual outer horizon is what's also perceptually given, but not focal right now. It's the ground of the object, which is the figure of perception, the background, if you will. It's also given in my perceptual data, but it's not what I'm perceptually focused on right now. The empty outer horizon, by contrast, is not currently perceptually given. And we'll say that it's emptily co-intended with what's perceptually given. And by that I mean, even though it's not specifically given to me in any kind of perceptual data I have right now, with what I am perceiving, I have a kind of anticipation, a kind of directedness towards these further possible contents of experience that are not presently given right now. Okay, so that's kind of the brief typology. And I'll illustrate that with this image, which I'm embarrassed to admit I spent the better part of the weekend working on. You might not be that impressed, but please do appreciate that this took some time. So I've gone on vacation to a tropical island, and because it's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it, I've brought my hockey stick with me. So the hockey stick is here on the tropical island with me. And we're using this viewfinder, this kind of frame here, to show everything that I'm currently perceiving. So that's my visual field. The object that's focal in it is the stick, and everything that's also given in visual data, in perception right now, but that I'm not focused on, that's what I've called the actual horizon. Okay, so it's actual because it's also perceptually given right now, but it's not focal. Now, outside of the viewfinder, what I'm not seeing right now, I'm not getting any visual data on this. This is the empty horizon. So you'll see within the actual horizon, we have the trunk of this palm tree, most of this palm tree. And then in the empty horizon, we have the rest of this tree that I'm not currently perceiving. And we'll say that on some level, because of what I am currently perceiving, I'm also directed in some sense to what's beyond my current actual perception. So if I scale my vision up the tree and start to look at the leafy part of this palm tree up here, that's what I'm going to expect to see. And if something radically different turns up in my perception as I adjust my glance, that's going to be a surprise to me. And for that reason, we'll say my empty intention, my empty outer horizon contains these further possible objects and continuations of perceptual experience. Okay. Now, so far the way I've been talking about the empty outer horizon is primarily in terms of further spatial determinations. So let's call that the spatiotemporal empty outer horizon. Further spatial relations that can be made present in the unfolding course of experience. So I've given the illustration of the tropical island, but we might also think of the room that you're in right now. It contains a series of other connecting rooms. Maybe it's in a building, maybe on a university campus, in a neighborhood, in a city. These would be the kind of expanding further layers of the empty outer horizon as we zoom farther and farther away from our current perceived moment. But I also want to talk about what we could call a practical empty outer horizon. And rather than just being what's kind of adjacently spatially connected to my current experience, the practical outer horizon involves, we could say, typical activities, goals, contexts, other equipment or objects, and other individuals that are relevant to this object of perception. And those don't have to be adjacent in actual space-time right now. They don't have to be behind me or close by, but because of the kind of experience and relationship I have to this object, the way I perceive it and the way I typically interact with it will kind of call to mind and bring within the broader associational context these other relevant possibilities. And so we can say that those are in the practical empty outer horizon. Now, this is not a static determinate horizon. It doesn't so much refer to a specific other object or space. It's rather a general or indeterminate style or structure of interaction, based again on the ways that I typically interact with the object of perception or objects of its kind, typical ways that I would interact with it. Now, Heidegger will say the stick refers to these horizontally associated possibilities, and I'm going to get some mileage out of that term refers, because you might think that's being used kind of equivocally here when we talk about a stick being associated with other stuff that we do with the hockey stick, as opposed to the way we use the word refer when we're talking about words or language. But I'm going to say there's actually a deep continuity between these two senses of refer. And if we talk about what's in the empty outer horizon as kind of possibilities for further continuations of experience, we can say that they can be actualized in different modes of experience. So the most typical way to actualize would be in action or perception itself. So I could bring that stick into contact with some other item in the outer horizon and bring that into my perception, into my sphere of action. But I can also actualize in another sense by recalling something to memory or imagining some possibility of experience that's kind of suggested to me by the stick. Okay, so returning to our desert island. On my tropical island, I have my hockey stick. And even though on the one hand, in the empty outer horizon, we have further spatial determinations of what actually happens to be around me while I'm on the island, because of the way I interact with the stick and because of my kind of habitual associations and what typically comes to mind and experience for me with the stick, in another sense, we can say that the empty outer horizon also directs me to these other kinds of things, these other activities, objects, and contexts where the hockey stick is relevant for me. So in a sense, in that sort of associational space of the horizon, something like the hockey net, the puck, the rink where I typically play, others who I play hockey with, those are in some sense closer in what we might call the space of the empty outer horizon than the actual physical surroundings of the tropical island, which don't have much to do with the typical hockey context, if you will. So just reviewing briefly, the perceived object is the hockey stick, but within these different outer horizons, I have the actual horizon that's also currently given in my view of the small palm tree, some water and some sand. There's an empty spatiotemporal horizon, the sun that I'm not looking at right now, the rest of that other palm tree, some more sand and water. But then there's this empty practical horizon of what's really relevant to the hockey stick as I typically interact with it. And that includes things that are not really close by in actual space and time, but then in a sense, if you'd say in the connections or the associations of relevance are closer by in the empty practical horizon, the net, the puck, the rink, other hockey players, etc. Okay, so just one more distinction to make when we're thinking about these outer horizons, sticking with the tool for now before we move on to the word. And the distinction is between what I'll call the observer's attitude and the participant's attitude. So far, we've been talking in terms of an observer's attitude. I'm looking at the hockey stick and it's bringing to mind these aspects of the empty practical horizon that we could say are kind of dimly primed or solicited or awakened in associational space by my perception of the stick. But it's the tool that remains focal in my perception, and these possibilities that are suggested in the horizon, they just remain possibilities for me. Now, by contrast, if I go into the participant's attitude, I actually put my skates on, go to a hockey rink somewhere, and start playing hockey, then the tool itself, the stick, is no longer going to be what's focal in my perception. I'm going to start using the stick instead of just looking at it. And for those familiar with the phenomenology, I'm drawing on Heidegger's famous analysis of what it's like to use a hammer here. And what's going to happen is I'm going to start moving into something that was previously just a possibility in the empty outer horizon of the stick as I was looking at it and perceiving it. And I'm going to start actualizing one of those possibilities, some possibility of action and interaction that previously was just an empty possibility in the practical outer horizon. I'm going to put the tool to work, and it's actually going to begin to bring that into reality. But as I do that, the tool itself, the hockey stick, fades into the background. It's no longer the focal object of perception for me. And what exactly I'm capable of directing my attention to will depend a little bit on just how skillful I am at skating and using a hockey stick. If you're kind of at a beginner level, you might still actually have to focus on the stick in your hands to move the puck around as you're skating and trying to coordinate all the stuff at once. Once you get a little bit better, you don't think about the stick so much. You might be looking at the puck, and then the stick starts to recede into the background. It becomes incorporated into your body, we could say, as you direct your attention to further possibilities. And as you get even better, you don't have to look at the stick or the puck even, and you're looking up ice, you're looking where you're skating, you're looking at your teammates, and you're looking forward to the possibilities that you want to actualize through this tool. But the tool itself, with your increasing level of skill, becomes increasingly incorporated into your bodily activity and recedes to some extent into the background. And what I'm going to suggest is that something deeply analogous happens when we are skilled language users. Language, in some respect, even as we use it, recedes into the background so that we can move through language to the state of affairs we want to discuss, the objects we're discussing, the ideas we're expressing in language. And I think there's a deep analogy, maybe even a continuity, we could say, between what happens with the tool and what happens with the word. So let's move on to seeing how this understanding of a horizon of perception can also be applied not just to tools and objects of perception in general, but to language and to words quite specifically. There would be some things to say about these first two moments of horizonality that I discussed, typification and the inner horizon. That's not my focus for today, so I'm going to glance over that and move into the actual outer horizon of the word. So when I perceive language, and I'm using as my paradigm case here, spoken language, so spoken interaction. When I'm perceiving or processing language, we can talk about different horizonal moments that appear within just the actual horizon. So what's given in kind of the current phase of experience. There's first what we might call a lexical horizon. So I don't perceive a word as kind of an individual word for the most part, but generally words come in sentences, they come in conversations, they come in unfolding discourse. And so these, I'm going to say, are kind of the lexical surrounding the contextual, the word context, the context of other words in which our perception of language unfolds. Now, to what extent this belongs to the actual horizon and when it fades into the empty horizon is an interesting question. I'm not sure exactly what the kind of temporal expanse of the actual horizon is, but we'll say we don't just perceive one word in isolation, but we perceive them in kind of a string of words. And so within the actual horizon of perceiving language, we have an unfolding sentential context. There's also the spatiotemporal context. This is just the broader environmental setting in which my conversation, say, is unfolding. And within this actual outer horizon, there are other elements that might be there. So I'll use the little diamond here for possibility. But it might be that there's a practical context, what's salient at the time, that's relevant to this actual outer horizon of speech perception. It might be that there's a referential context, that is what we're talking about, might be there in my present perception as well. But of course, with language, it doesn't have to be. We can talk about things that are displaced in time and space, or that are strictly imaginary or non-existent. And generally, there'll be some sort of intersubjective context, my interlocutors with whom I'm engaging in that actual horizon of what's given right now. Okay. And we can also use this empty horizontal structure to think about what's given. And there are two primary dimensions of the empty horizon of the word that I want to focus on today. The first is also a lexical empty horizon. And this might be different from the actual one, because of course, with any given word, with our perception of language, there's going to be a lot of other associated terms that come up for us that don't have to be explicitly spoken in that actual context. So just based again on my past familiarity and experience with the language, hearing a word will call to mind a lot of other associated terms that we could say are nearby in the space of the empty horizon. But the empty horizon also contains with it what we could call the referential dimension of that empty horizon. And this is the direction towards the associated, what I'm here calling the typified intended object that's designated by that word. That's going to become clear with an example. And the example, of course, is the hockey stick. So when I hear the word hockey stick, say, coming up in conversation, there's going to be this empty lexical horizon of typically associated terms, say shoot, pass, the puck, the ice, the goal. This is going to be kind of primed on some level by my perception of the word. And linguists and psycholinguists study how these kind of relationships of association and priming work. So we can draw on those studies to kind of fill this in, along with the phenomenological analysis. And then there's also going to be an empty horizon directing me towards what we might call the referent, but what I'm describing here as the type hockey stick itself, as I'm familiar with interacting with it in perception and action. And I'll draw our attention towards a couple of studies in a moment that I think help clarify this. But basically what happens when you perceive the word, especially if it's for something that you're familiar with having an interaction with, is that you'll find sensory motor areas of the brain that would be associated with interacting with this object also get excited along with the processing of the word. And we'll see in a moment that those are differentiated depending on the type of word and the type of interaction you would have with that object typically. This is sometimes called a motor image that's elicited. And a motor image is kind of a funny concept for us to wrap our heads around. But just as the word hockey stick might call to mind something like a visual representation of a hockey stick, it also primes my body or excites my body in some way for bodily interaction with a hockey stick. And as I keep saying this word hockey stick, I can almost feel my hands trembling a little bit with the anticipation of holding a hockey stick in my hands, of taking a shot with the stick. And this is something like that motor image getting excited in sensory motor areas of the brain and really rippling through my body as I feel just in a very slight offline kind of activation of what it would be like to interact with the hockey stick that's triggered just by the word itself. Okay, and so roughly the picture that I'm presenting here and that you can find defended by some authors working loosely in what we might call embodied and enactive approaches to language and language perception is that the same brain regions are activated to a greater or lesser extent when we do a number of different things. For one, when we actually use a tool. Not surprisingly, when I use the hockey stick, I'm engaging sensory motor areas of the brain. But those also get lit up, not just the visual areas, but also the motor areas associated with using that tool when I just look at the tool or a picture of it. I'll have not just visual activation, but also a somatosensory activation in the brain. And that happens too if we just imagine or remember that object. We get a visual and also somatosensory activation in the brain of areas associated with interacting with that object. And the same thing happens when we process language that refers to or designates that object. So the idea here is that there's kind of a continuity and perhaps a parasitic relationship of dependence here in the language processing, imagination or other thought relating to the object, and the areas of the brain, the sensory motor areas that would actually be involved in interacting with the object. And so we could say that these higher modes of cognition in imagining or remembering, and also in language processing, are some way interrelated with or dependent on these more basic sensory motor modes of interacting with the thing. Here's some neuroimaging data from one study that explored these kind of interactions. And in the left, you see the neuroimaging that we get from people actually performing movement. So the blue areas are for foot movements, red is for finger movement, green is for tongue movement. And you see we're getting a slightly larger activation over here than we are on the right, which is just someone passively reading active action words that are associated with these different parts of the body. So leg-related words, arm-related words, and face-related words. And it's important to note that these activations are somatotopically distinct. And that means that we get a correspondence. It's a little bit rough, but you can see the correspondence here between leg-related words and leg-related activity. It's roughly the same brain area. Arm-related words and arm-related activity, and face-related words and face-related activity. Note also for language processing, you're getting strong activation here in the frontal and prefrontal left hemisphere. And that's where you have those typical areas of language processing, Wernicke's and Broca's area. But whereas previously it was thought that those were kind of independent language processing modules, we're now seeing that they're functioning more like hubs, interacting with other brain areas that are involved in language processing, and that they're not utterly independent in that task, but are strongly interrelated with especially sensory motor areas of the brain. Okay, so this is a little bit hard on the eyes, and you don't need to try to take in all of this, but this is something like the typology of horizons that I developed based on the preceding analysis. But the main area that we want to focus on here and that's relevant for us is that the perceived word has these outer horizons, and specifically there's an empty outer horizon. And within that is activated something like a referential intention that's directed towards the intended object in a kind of typical way of interacting with it. And I'm taking as kind of a loose corroboration of that the neuroimaging studies that show activation in sensory motor areas of the brain with language processing. Okay, just continuing with this analogy a little bit further, we saw when we discussed tools in action that when we move from that kind of just observer's attitude towards the participant's attitude, and we actually start interacting with the tool, that when we actualize a possibility of the empty outer horizon, the tool itself kind of recedes into the background. It's no longer focal in perception, and we move through the tool towards what we're trying to achieve in perception, and our attention redirects. And I want to say the same thing happens with the word in action. When you're listening to me speak right now, you're probably not focused on spoken words itself. You're not focusing, unless you're having a hard time understanding me, I hope you're not. But you're probably not focused on the words themselves that I'm speaking, but you're interested in what I'm saying. You're being redirected through my words towards what we're talking about, towards the ideas, towards the content of my speech, rather than being hung up on the words themselves. And I'm saying that's analogous to what happens when we use a tool to move into some horizontal possibility that's associated with that tool. But there are a couple of important differences that I want to note here. I think they're differences in degree rather than differences in kind, but they're worth noting. The first is that on the one hand, with the tool, we have something more like natural causal interactions, whereas with language, the associations that structure the horizon are more conventional. So the tool, the empty outer horizon, is shaped by real natural causal relations that, say, the hockey stick has entered into. Whereas with the word, the outer empty horizons are shaped primarily by conventional relations of associations that we've formed over time. I don't think that's an absolute difference, because I actually think that a lot of what's elicited to mind by the tool in its empty outer horizon is also kind of conventional associations. So I don't think we need to get hung up on this too much, but it is one of the distinctions to note. And also note that in the typical mode of actualization, when we talk about making some possibility of the empty horizon actual in experience, for the tool, the typical way to do that is in perception and action. So I actually put the hockey stick to work to actualize some possibility from the empty outer horizon. Whereas with the word, we can do this in perception and action by actually bringing about the state of affairs that we're discussing, or we can do it just in imagination, just in memory, or just in thought. As my words are directing you to think about something, you don't actually have to make that state of affairs real in order to have it be present to your mind. You can achieve it just through the kind of virtual or offline modes of cognition that language really makes available to us. And a lot of the power of language consists in its ability to make things present to us without actually having to make them real in the world. And to that extent, language is something like a tool of the imagination or a tool of thought. I have a couple of kind of formal comments about discussing continuities between perception and action with tools and words. Those, I think, are not as important for what I want to get across today as discussing the scaling up problem. So I'm going to move on to that for the final part of my presentation today. So the scaling up problem has been presented to advocates of embodied and enactive approaches to cognition. And some critics grant that these approaches may do a good job of giving accounts of non-representational interactions in, say, perception and action. And we'll call those lower order or online modes of cognition. Lower order because they're the most basic modes of cognition in the animal kingdom and in human life, and online because the object or the state of affairs that they interact with is directly given to them in the current data of perception and action through the body. And in those cases, we use the world as its own model, as the saying goes. So we don't really need to represent the world in an offline kind of way, because we have all the data that we need from the world for perception and action in those cases. And so some critics say, okay, yeah, I guess embodied approaches do well there for perception and action, but how do you handle higher order modes of cognition, things like thought, imagination, language, that is offline, that doesn't directly have its object or state of affairs given in the current perception or action? And the typical way of expressing this is to say that these are representation hungry. It seems like they can't work without some internal representation of the missing object or state of affairs, because these can deal with abstract, absent, or non-existent objects and state of affairs, unlike perception and action. So that's how the concern goes. It applies to cases like thinking, imagining, planning, remembering, and language. And this is a challenge for proponents of embodied and enactive approaches to cognition. And one of the lines of response, or the kind of typical line of response from defenders of Fourier approaches, is to say that there's actually a continuity between lower and higher order and between online and offline cognition. The break between these isn't as radical as what the critics want to say. And they'll emphasize, as I do, there's a developmental grounding of higher order abilities in the more fundamental abilities. So as you look at how children acquire their abilities to do things like imagine, to think about absent states of affairs, to use language, we can find these kind of incremental steps that they make, moving from cases of perception and action towards these more remote and offline modes of cognition. Now, some people propose that there's an affordance structure of thought, imagination, etc. And one person who does this is our friend Julian, who's with us today. So Julian, I couldn't resist using this picture of you. So a couple of different ways to do this. This is from Sean Gallagher. Gallagher says that pragmatically considered, concepts or thoughts can be regarded as nothing other than affordances that offer or solicit to us possibilities to follow one path or another as we engage in thinking. So affordances, the notion comes from ecological psychology and is usually used to discuss relationships between an animal and its environment, and to say how, depending on the skills, the abilities, the knowledge, and the interests of the animal, different possibilities for perception and action will be presented by the environment. So my hockey stick, because of my kind of skills and interests, will afford playing hockey and doing the different techniques involved in using the stick. My coffee cup, because of my skills and bodily possibilities, affords me gripping it for a sip of coffee, etc. So those are the kind of paradigm cases of affordance. And folks who take this approach to responding to the scaling up challenge say that we can extend that kind of notion to also apply to higher order cognition. And here's Julian working with Eric Rietveld and saying that affordances of a linguistically structured environment allow for engaging in abstract and symbolic modes of cognition. Now, my own view is I'm largely sympathetic to these proposals. I think they're probably complementary to what I'm doing. And I'm interested to know whether they're more competing or complementary. That's something I'm still yet to work out. I do have the concern that most of what I've seen so far remains largely abstract and programmatic. So I'm not sure how the details work out. And this is especially the case where language is concerned. So my proposal is that we use the notion of horizons instead of affordances. My general approach to the scaling up problem, I think you've already seen it through what I've presented, and by making language a thoroughly perceptual, actional phenomena, is to base language in more phenomenologically and developmentally basic processes, and to see it as an extension of characteristics and practices and qualities that are already at play in the perceptual world. And we just kind of elaborate these incrementally to get to something like the symbolic structure of language. So I restore this continuity and I bridge the gap by, on the one hand, you could say dumbing down language. That sounds a little bit crude, but basically I say, no, language is not so radically different from other modes of cognition that we're already quite familiar with. And on the other hand, I smarten up perception and action. I say, no, there's actually a lot more intelligence. There's already something like a referential structure at play in perception and language that develops continuously into those similar structures in language. So it's already there in perception. We don't need to import radically different cognitive capacities to understand what goes on in language, because much of those structures are already at play in perception and action. So when deciding which of these options to go with, or some combined approach, and I've set this up as kind of an opposition, but I don't think it necessarily has to be that. But I'm just going to propose some evaluation criteria when we're looking at different concepts that we could use, comparing these two proposals. What do we need this concept to do? What's the work it's supposed to do for us? Well, it's supposed to establish continuity between lower and higher online and offline cognition. So that's what we need to choose between these concepts for. And when we look at different features of language or higher cognition that we need to account for, we need to have a concept that allows for both, on the one hand, precision and specificity, because something like the reference relationship of a term to the thing that it refers to, a word to its referent, can be actually quite precise. So we need a notion that's going to allow for that kind of precision, while on the other hand, allowing for the openness and flexibility of imagination and free thought, because that's something that language allows to us. So whatever concept we use to try to bridge between lower and higher modes of cognition should achieve this, allow for both of these things. And I'll say it should be phenomenologically adequate. And by that, I just mean it should be faithful to our experience of language. And it also needs to be empirically respectable. Specifically, it needs to be operationalizable. We need to be able to put it in play in the empirical work that we do in the cognitive sciences. And this is where my notion of the horizon has the most work yet to be done. So I sum up my last slide here, just presenting a bit of an interim report card as I assess it to these two notions. And this is totally work in progress and also just a little bit of fun. So don't take this too seriously, and Julian's gonna help us fill this out a little bit more maybe. But I'm giving the notion of a horizon an A for establishing continuity. I think it does a nice job of showing how perception is interacting with higher modes of cognition and how we get this fluid kind of continuity between online and offline cognition. The notion of affordance, it's a question mark just because I'm not saying it can't do that. I just don't know if it does that. Note also that I made up the grading criteria, so that's a little bit unfair. I've said that these, whatever notion we use to do this work should allow for both precision and specificity and openness and flexibility. I think someone could reasonably have the concern that this notion of the horizon is too kind of vague and open-ended to really be modified to capture the specificity and precision of linguistic reference. I don't think it's an insurmountable challenge, but someone might say, no, what's going on with that kind of reference is too precise to be captured by this very open-ended notion of a horizon. And again, for affordances, I'm not sure if we think it does that work well. I do think the horizon does a nice job of capturing the openness and flexibility of the kind of cognition and thought that language allows for us. So I like that about the notion of horizon. And affordance, I'm still waiting to know if it does that work. The notion of horizon, I think, is pretty good for describing what our experience is like of interacting with language. Someone could point out that no phenomenologist had thought to apply it to language processing before, and that that's a little bit surprising. But I think once we adapt those structures from perception and action to describe our experience of language, I think that this notion of the horizon can do a good job of capturing what it's like to use language and to interact with it. And again, on the affordance side, I'll be interested to hear if affordances can also do that work well. But then finally, I've said where I've got the most work to do here is to make this notion empirically respectable. How could it actually concretely interact with work in the cognitive sciences? Oh, and sorry, WIP, it just means it's a work in progress. I don't know if you get that on report cards in Europe and Brazil and other parts of the world where folks are coming from. But when I was a kid in Canada, if they didn't quite want to fail you, they would say, this is a work in progress. So I'm saying my own approach here is a work in progress. Whereas I think there's a lot more precedent for the notion of affordance, of being kind of empirically respectable and engaged with concrete work in the cognitive sciences and psychology. So I'm giving an affordance an A over there and saying I've got some catching up to do if I want my notion of horizon to be in the discussion as well. I think that's where I'm going to leave it for now, because I've used my time, and I'm very interested to hear what my commentators have to say on these topics. So thank you so much to everyone for your attention, and yes, looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Hayden. It was a great talk. I think we're going to have about 5 minutes now for just taking some water, just a quick break. And I'm starting to count here, turning my camera off for 5 minutes, and I'll be back soon. Feel free to do the same.
Great.
We still have a minute before we start. How is the weather there in Amsterdam, Julian?
It's pretty miserable. A lot of rain. Yeah, we're in autumn now, and it's typical autumn weather. How about for you? It looks really sunny out there.
Yeah. It's quite hot outside. Yeah. Good. I am going to take the half minute that we still have to welcome Professor Eros Carvalho from Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Inês, do you have slides? Do you want to share your screen or anything like that? Or
Yes, I would like to do that. Let me just get to it straight away.
Wonderful.
Here we go.
Yeah, perfect. So
okay, you can see it, and you can see when I go back and forth. Yeah.
Yes, perfect.
All right. Well, let me know. I'm ready when you are.
Yes, feel free. Welcome.
Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, to start, I'd just like to say hi to everybody in Brazil, because many of you here are in Brazil, and just like to say hi there. And I would like to thank Hayden. So Hayden has a very carefully crafted paper, and it just presented it beautifully, and it was quite a privilege to have that paper presented to us, giving us all this extra material, which yeah, was quite rich. So thank you so much, Hayden, for your presentation. I will just pick out on where you left on the comparison between the horizons and the affordances. And because Julian is here with us, I'm going to leave that question for Julian to handle. And I am mostly going to focus on the horizons and sort of like bring up some ideas and questions, pressing that a little bit so that we are able to tighten up a little bit the ideas around that, hopefully. Okay, that will be sort of my contribution. All right, so, but before that, I'd just like to very, very briefly sort of recap Hayden's argument, just so to make sure that I understood it properly and that we are on the same page and that kind of thing. So I take Hayden to be arguing that, sorry, even before that, to aim to bring to light some commonalities between an object as a tool and the spoken word. And aims to do that by establishing some conditions for that common characterization by the light of the horizons, as we know from the phenomenological tradition. So the conditions that he brings up and establishes is, as he said, the inner and the outer, where the outer, if I take correctly, is a phenomenological relation aspects that include affective, intersubjective, perceptual, practice, and that kind, where the actual corresponds to the background and the empty to the continuation of the experience beyond the background. Okay, then we have a third condition, which is the participant, which is a participant where we have a distinction to be, a very important distinction to be made between novice and expert, where the expert, to my understanding, is very interestingly described as embodying a kind of a skill, which is very clear from the description, I think, or at least I thought so, on using the stick and the description that you very beautifully make. Right. So the argument in the end is to say that these tools and spoken words share these horizons. But why does Hayden care about that? Well, because he wants to speak to a stronger point. He wants to speak to the main criticism that is typically made to e-cognition, the scaling up problem. And as he just mentioned, this is the problem that e-cognition, or the criticism that e-cognition as a non-representationalist account of cognition cannot account for high-level cognition such as thought, belief, or language, and rather only to lower-level cognition such as perception or action. However, and this is what motivates this paper, I take, if Hayden is able to show us that language as a higher level cognitive capacity or skill involves the same aspects as perception or action, which is taken to be a lower level, then this will speak to the stronger scaling up problem that e-cognition will be a suitable framework to understand both lower level and higher levels of cognition. So this is the structure of his argument. I'll probably just skip that. Yeah, just summing up what I just said. Yeah, so now moving to some brainstorming and thinking. So I've got like a few ideas, one idea per slide. I don't know if we want to go slide by slide or if I should just go over the presentation and then you would like to go back, Hayden.
I don't have a preference, or maybe I will have one after I see the first slide.
Okay, okay, that's fair. That's fair. Okay, so, right. Okay, because okay, it would be really great to just think together and brainstorming a little bit on some ideas and thoughts that I got from reading the paper. Okay, so if I understand correctly, if the outer horizon involves experience, then it might be at odds with the formulation, for example, when you say words as networks of typical associations that inform our perception and interaction. So I was a little bit puzzled about this because, to my understanding, the question that was coming to my mind was, in what sense is a perceptual experience and interaction informed by a word? So this was not quite clear to me because I was wondering if it is the word not part of the perceptual experience already, or are words such that they inform or are experienced? Which one of the two? Do words inform or are experienced? And I take this to be relevant to the claim that you want to make as it's describing it through the outer horizon. So I'm not sure here about whether they should be understood as informing or experienced, or even both. So then, yeah, I think I had something else. So these I take to be relevant also to speak to the comparison or on the continuity between your account on horizons and affordances, because I'll just say this. I think that the distinction to be made, or the way we can find some answers, is by the role that representations play. So I take this to be relevant to the point that if we take words to inform experience, then it seems that we are kind of accounting or taking words to be outside of the experience. In a way, this could be more compatible with representationalism and information theory. And at some point, you also say something like operating with words, and you also say operating with words, operating with objects. And I just wonder what do you mean here, because it might be interpreted either in one side or the other. So, so the question is, would this be closer to computationalism as opposed to a phenomenal account? I would take the latter because that's the one that you want to pursue. So I just, some clarification on this particular, I think, would be interesting, and perhaps would speak to the comparison with affordances. I don't know if you want to jump, or shall I continue?
Yeah, thanks, Inês. I'll just maybe say a word by way of clarification, or hopefully so, to your second point there. and then I hope my clarification will allow you to tell me the answer to question in the third point. I think I know the answer, but I hope you'll agree with me. So I should mention one thing that I had a bit of trouble with in formulating this is I wanted to use structures of kind of paradigmatically perceptual experience to describe language, perception, or processing. But what seems a little bit odd about this is that we don't usually talk about perceiving speech when we converse with one another. And the comparison between a thematic object of perception, or the thing that's a focal object of perception, as opposed to speech, might feel a little bit strained there. And that's why it's important for me to push the comparison to the object in use, more so than the object that we're just kind of looking at, because that's where I think that the comparison comes out more clearly. But whether it's speaking of perception or processing or experience is the best way to get at this has remained a little bit unclear to me. But in any case, to the question, is the word not part of perceptual experience already? My answer is definitely yes. So I want this to all be on the level of perception, broadly construed, but so broadly construed to include not just, you know, something that we're looking at or focally directed towards, but everything that's in the total realm of, say, sensory motor input or experience at that time. And in that sense, to the second part of the question, do words inform experience or are they experienced? I think when I was using the term inform earlier, what I meant was that horizons inform the way we experience the object. And that especially concerns that first one, that level of typicality that I talked about at the beginning, that we apply a kind of type structure to perception. That would be kind of a top-down level of perceptual processing that informs how we then experience the object or the current perceptual situation, whatever the case may be. So that was the sense in which I was saying that the horizons inform the experience. Now I had one brief slide that I glossed over about how that structure of typification may apply to the experience of language. And I can't remember if I talk about that briefly in the paper, but I did skip over it today in the presentation.
Okay, thanks so much for the clarification, Hayden. Yes, I thought that's what I thought that was the answer, and yeah, I was just worried because you might be pressed on that, right? So that's why I thought I should raise this up in the sense that I was just thinking, okay, if words inform, do objects also inform? Because if one thing applies to one, then it should apply to the other as well. So that's why, yeah, I thought I would raise this one. Thank you so much. I'll just gonna move to the other slide. So then the other thing that came up that I was thinking about was perception as expectation, which okay, so when you say that perception of the object we see involves certain habitually structured expectations about the perceptual features of objects and the kinds of sensory motor projects I can undertake with them, which is a sort of anticipatory priming of our sensory motor ability. And yes, and I take this to be very self-explanatory, and I see why you're using it. But again, I was a little bit worried here, and I'll just gonna pressure this a little bit as well and see how we go thinking together. So I was thinking about this, and I was thinking that, well, representationalists arguing, and again, let's just bear in mind what the sort of like the main aim of the paper is, which is speaking to the scale-up problem and making sure that we protect against that. So representationalists arguing against e-cognition would likely agree with your formulation of perception as expectation. I just thought that maybe this would need like a little bit of an unpacking here, because they could be, well, okay, Hayden, we totally agree with your account. It makes all the sense, and we can take both perception action and language to be a sort of an expectation in terms of, as we know, predictive accounts of cognition, for example, and that could be like an objection that can be made to your account, as in, instead of formulating action, perception, and language in the horizons, they may say that, well, because you are taking this to be a sort of a structured expectations, then I thought that maybe just a little bit of a clarification would be good to have here, because I don't think that you are taking this route, but it could be sort of inviting a little bit of criticism. So the other thought I had on this account was, in which case they might say that, oh, I already said that perception of an object and the spoken word is simply representation and processing of information. So how would we respond to this? What would be your account of expectation that you have in mind here?
Yeah, thanks, Inês. I think the first thing I want to say in response to this is kind of a more global comment, which is that I think I've mostly done phenomenological description in this paper, in a loose sense of saying this is what I take the experience, the first person experience of these phenomena to be like. Now, I think that those phenomenological descriptions are probably consistent, at least logically. They're consistent with a broad range of theories about what the underpinning subpersonal mechanisms are. So even though, yeah, I have my own kind of commitments about that, and I think one picture works better than another, I think someone could take all of the same phenomenal descriptions that I'm giving of experience and say, yes, and the underlying subpersonal mechanisms are representational, are computational, are embodied non-representational. Like, I think just the phenomenal descriptions themselves are at least logically consistent with any range of views about what's going on subpersonally. Now, that said, I don't think it's an accident that phenomenological accounts and embodied phenomenological accounts have found a kind of natural bedfellow with more embodied and active and non-representationalist approaches. And I think taking kind of the paradigm case of perception to be sort of the baseline, I think if we can say that the phenomenological account of perception that's given fits best with a non-representationalist account, the further strategy is to say, and these other aspects that come with it, these kind of openings into anticipation, elements of imagination that might be involved, these are all branching out of a basic, or they're either based on or extending from a fundamental account of perception as non-representational. And if you get the fundamental account of perception as non-representational, and the other aspects, anticipation, imagination, expectation, whatever else may come out of that, if that's seen as developing fluidly from a fundamentally non-representational account of perception, then I don't see where you would need to, in that kind of continuous picture, I don't see any moment when you would need to bring in a representationalist account. So I think that's my response to that query. I can't tell if you're satisfied.
I totally agree. So then I would just ask you one follow-up question, which would be, would you think that these would be two complementary accounts to the extent that, okay, we have a phenomenological description on the experiential level of perception and all these other cognitive capacities or abilities, and then we can have this phenomenological account complemented by the underlying mechanisms or substrates that give rise or allow for the phenomenal experience to happen. Would you think that this makes sense? Would they be complementary?
Yeah. And figuring out like what kind of language we need. Like I've only talked in the loosest way about correlations between the phenomenological descriptions I'm giving and what I see happening in neuroimaging studies. But that was such a very loose and kind of preliminary discussion, and finding just the weakest form of corroboration there. And I definitely need, or at least a comprehensive theory of the mind that does justice to both the phenomenal level of description and the subpersonal level, I think is going to need some sort of much more precise bridging strategy than what I've given to talk about these correlations, because I haven't given anything like that. If you look at something like the neurophenomenological proposal of Varela, he uses, I think it's dynamic systems theory in that context, to be kind of the formal language that bridges between a subpersonal neurological level of description and a phenomenal level of description. I've remained neutral on how to do that, and I'm just assuming that there's some way to do that. But I haven't figured it out yet. I don't know what it is, and I haven't taken a strong stance on what the best way to do that is.
No, for sure, and I think that's precisely a point that yeah, the way that you conceive of these structured expectations is quite relevant, precisely to find a bridge if you want to find that bridge, right? Because what I'm thinking is that I'm not so sure that there is a complementarity between between the experience, the phenomenological experience description, and the predictive accounts of cognition. And the reason just being that in the phenomenological description, we, or at least as you very well presented it, do not necessarily take representations to play, to be necessary or to play an explanatory role, if I understand correctly. Whereas typically the predictive accounts of cognition, they do tend to assume that there are representations that that exist and take place in the brain. So I'm not super sure if this is complementary or not. But in any case, I think the way that you take these structured expectations is really important, precisely because you're bringing in the neuroimaging data and evidence. So what is that going to speak to? That's sort of a question, but I think I've got that coming up. So maybe I'll just save that for later. But for now, yeah, that would be something that would be just to think about from a naturalist perspective, whether this can be thought as together, or if that's what you have in mind or not, would be just something that I was thinking about.
Yeah, thanks for flagging that for me, Inês. I think you're right. That'll be interesting for me to follow through further when I work out those correlations or what the best bridging strategy is in more detail.
It's just that to me, I find that one of the most difficult things is to bridge the phenomenology with the data that we get from neuroimaging, because I'm not super sure if we're talking about the same thing. So that's what I always find very difficult to bridge. Anyway, so the other thing that I was thinking about relates actually to Thomas Hook's work, and I found this to be super interesting in the paper, which is about the expert participant. And I quite like that. I think it's it's beautifully described, and I think you're really nailing it on the description of like the way that you that the stick becomes. And I wanted just to highlight here a new concept, if I may, which is the transparency that Fuchs talks about. I think, which is very relevant here. So yeah, so this is the way that you characterized the expert participant seems to invoke the notion of embodiment. So meaning here something like when someone is an expert on performing a certain skill, it seems that that is embodied. And here, to the extent that you are performing a skill, that you're actually using an object that is to perform that skill. So to an extent, it seems that not only the body becomes transparent, as Fuchs would say, I think, but also that's how embodied the stick becomes, but also the stick becomes transparent. So at least that's what I took to that you were saying, that I thought would be interesting to connect with that. So, and then again, you also say that, well, the stick is only brought to the attention when actually something goes wrong, right? And when the stick breaks or something like that, that's when I bring my attention to the stick. And that's exactly the concept as you know, of transparency by Thomas Hookes. When something goes wrong with my body, that's when I bring my attention to it. And I thought that was like really, really cool. Then I just, yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I think we have our time is running off.
Yeah.
if you mind summing up, and maybe if you have other things left by the to the end, that would be great.
Just a few ideas. So basically, I'll just run through it. How long do I have left?
You are over your time by 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. So, yeah. Okay. So basically, I'll just wrap up. Okay. I'll just say that I had these ideas about expert participant. I thought it was very beautiful. And then, yeah, I was thinking about words and the way that what is it that words provoke the listener. And then I had the neuroimaging, which is we already discussed, so that's all good. And wrapping up, I just wanted to say that we have a brilliant comparative analysis between tools and spoken word, and I would be super curious to see a follow-up from you, Hayden, exploring specifically the spoken word as a tool. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Inês. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
No problem, pleasure.
I'd like to invite Julian to step in. If you have slides, we cannot hear you at the moment. Yes, perfect. We still cannot hear you. Oh, now, yes, yeah.
Sorry.
That's fine. Wonderful.
Sorry about that. Let me go full screen. So I've done more of a talk in response to Hayden rather than a Q&A, and I will do my best to get through it in plenty of time so we have time left for discussion. And I had maybe more than I needed on just a recap on the talk, so I can go through that quite quickly. Where I want to start from is something that we're calling the skilled intentionality framework here in Amsterdam, which is our attempt at providing from within philosophy some conceptual tools, or what we call bridging concepts, that can connect phenomenology to inactive ecological 4E cognitive science, so non-representational post-cognitivist cognitive science that doesn't explain the mind as a computer that computes over representations, but instead tries to use non-representational tools from inaction theory and from ecological psychology to provide a post-cognitivist cognitive science. And what we try to do as philosophers is provide a set of concepts that can connect the living organism, so the whole embodied living organism, as discussed in activism, in its environment, as discussed in ecological psychology, with the idea of the living body, the lived body, lived experience in a life world, as described in phenomenology. So what I thought would be interesting to try to do today would be to take up the idea of the horizon and see if we could provide some bridging concepts from our skilled intentionality framework that would enable us to take that concept out of phenomenology and then connect it back to non-representational post-cognitivist ideas in cognitive science. And that's a lot to do, that's a whole talk. So, you know, I'm not going to be able to get very far with it, but I've got some ideas about how to do that. And that will speak to the points that Hayden was making at the end as well about this possible competition between his account of the word as a tool, using the notion of horizon, and the work that we've been doing in the skilled intentionality framework, where we also start from this idea of words as tools, but instead of looking to the horizon, we've looked to the notion of an affordance. And we can see these as in competition with each other, but I think they're not actually. So the notion of a field of affordances that we use is actually our way of capturing the horizon. And so it turns out that I think there's a convergence of these ideas really once we have a distinction between what we call solicitations and affordances, or between the landscape of affordance and the field of affordances. Okay, so Hayden says, I prefer the language of horizons as it was designed to encompass associative relations spanning our entire experiential life, and not merely its practical and perceptual features. So there's an idea there that there's something in our entire experiential life which the horizon notion can capture, but Affordances is more restricted in that it's just going to tell us about the practical and perceptual features of the horizon, but not reach out to maybe the intersubjective and the affective. So I'm going to have to say something about that if I'm going to provide a bridging concept. I don't need to go through the horizon again, but the part of the analysis of the horizon that I wanted to pick up on was actually this notion of the empty horizon as it applies both to tools and to language. So the hockey stick in Heidegger's tool analysis, we can think of in relation to a wider network of equipment and practices that define how those tools can be used correctly in particular situations. So the notion of the horizon that I want to focus on, it's a very rich notion, as we've seen, is this notion of an empty horizon, where that empty horizon is not spatiotemporal, but is to do with what practical implications, what reference there is from the tool to the wider practices. And the question I then want to take up is, well, is it right to say that perceived words also have an outer horizon? And I think they do. So we see this very nicely with the example of it's Tim on the phone, hearing the name Tim. Hayden says summons the presence of his brother, a kind of pseudo presence of Tim in Hayden's experience. Alvanoe has talked about this in terms of presence in absence. And so the question is, well, how can Tim, Hayden's brother, who is traveling and so is not present in his environment, nevertheless be summoned up in Hayden's experience in this way through hearing the name Tim? So Inês's question about are words informing perceptual experience? Well, I think this is a nice illustration of how words themselves have a phenomenology to them, that they can actually summon up the presence of somebody that's absent. Hayden describes this in terms of weak imagination, a concept that he takes from Lomar, I think it is. And the idea here is that just like sensory motor activities are evoked just by looking at or elicited just by looking at the hockey stick, similarly hearing the word can evoke in your imagination the presence of the person that's named Tim. So the presence that Noe is talking about in relation to, say, the tool, where it has hidden aspects to it that are nevertheless present in their absence, Noe captures in terms of sensory motor understanding. And we can think there's something similar going on in the case of words, that words, through our habitual associations, as Hayden describes, I'm not sure that's the right word, but yeah, we can talk more about whether that's the right word or not. But hearing the name Tim activates some habitual associations or expectations about how Hayden has interacted with him in the past, how he is emotionally affected by Tim. All of these kinds of associations are elicited by hearing that name, and that's how Tim comes to have presence for Hayden in Hayden's experience. So that all, I think, is makes a lot of sense to me. But now let's think about how to use this notion of the horizon as a bridging concept. What Hayden proposes to do is to look at the brain, and what we get is a picture of linguistic horizons actually in the brain. So the habitual associations and the affective history that Hayden and Tim share is somehow activating circuits in the brain. These are overlapping circuits, as we saw in the brain imaging results. And so we have a story where there's some kind of correspondence between the phenomenological structure of the horizon as it applies both to words and tools, and these overlapping patterns of activity in the brain. So pressing on this a little bit in a similar way to Inês, I want to say, well, there's trouble lurking here potentially in that you might think that the patterns of neural activity that are activated both for sensory motor processing, imagining, remembering, and language now carry some kind of content. They are specifically about Tim, let's say. And that content is okay grounded in sensory motor experience because you've got the same neural circuits that are used for sensory motor control that are also active for imagining, remembering, and language processing. But still, it looks like you've got some neural circuits that have some specific content that they're carrying here. And I worry that that doesn't really fit very well with the phenomenology, because part of what Merleau-Ponty insists on, for instance, is that the horizon is indeterminate, and that indeterminacy is part of the positive phenomenology of the horizon. So he's saying this about perception, but he would also say it about speaking and spoken speech. So there's a kind of indeterminacy that we have to capture, and I'm not sure that if we look to the brain for our bridging concepts, that's going to be easy to do justice to in terms of the neural activity. But we might say, well, the neural activity we shouldn't think of as contentful. We should give some kind of Fourier account of what's going on in the brain. And actually, this idea of reusing of sensory motor circuits is completely embodied. So it looks like we have a Fourier-friendly account of what the brain is doing when it's processing language here. But then I wonder, how should we understand the correspondence between neural activations and the horizon of associations? Is it some kind of isomorphism, like was talked about in Gestalt psychology? How exactly should we think about that? So I want to propose an alternative, that we shouldn't look inside of the brain, but we should rather think of the brain as a dynamical system that is directly coupled to the environment. And you might think, well, that then means you can only deal with online cases, because if it all depends on direct coupling, what are we going to say about these cases of representation-hungry cognition? And the whole point of the skilled intentionality framework is to try to argue against any hard, sharp distinction between higher and lower cognition, or offline, online cognition. So in our work in the skilled intentionality framework, we take exactly the notion of the outer horizon as it's understood in perception, where there's, for instance, a reference to a network of equipment that comes along with the hammer. When you perceive the hammer, you also perceive, you also have this reference to the nails and the wood and all of the other paraphernalia that you find in the carpenter's workshop. It's Heidegger's tool analysis. We try to understand that in terms of a field of relevant affordances. So when you perceive the hammer, you're also ready for all of these other aspects of your environment that are referred to along with the hammer because of the outer horizon. So I want to finish up by saying, can we understand the horizon of words also in terms of a field of relevant affordances? So the inspiration here is Hubert Dreyfus, and Dreyfus's work on neurodynamics, where he was influenced by the neuroscientist Walter Freeman, who described the brain in terms of a tractile landscape. And the idea was that each affordance in the environment is directly coupled to a large-scale pattern of brain activity, which we can think of as an attractor basin. So what's a basin of attraction? Well, just imagine that you have your hand cupped and you put a ball into your hand, and the ball rolls down into the center of your hand. That's the ball settling into a stable state, a relatively stable state in your hand based on the perturbation of the ball. And similarly, there's an idea of the brain and large-scale patterns of activity in the brain as forming and stabilizing and then being perturbed and pushed out of those bases of attraction by what Inês would call prediction errors, or by some kind of sensory perturbation in the environment. So when we're thinking about the neurodynamics, well, we think of that in terms of a self-organizing system, a dynamical system that is coupled to a landscape of affordances. And based on your history, there are patterns of activation that then form in the brain that have been reinforced over time through past interaction with the environment, so that when you enter into a particular situation, your history of interaction means that these patterns of activation are forming in your brain that are tuning you to what's relevant in that situation. What's relevant we understand in terms of a field of affordances, which are captured here in this figure schematically in terms of the rectangles of different colors and heights. I'm not going to go into what the colors and heights mean exactly. We can talk more about that in the discussion if you want to. But the basic idea here is that we can think of the outer horizon here. So all of the other tools, if you like, that are referred to along with the hammer as included in the field of relevant affordances because of your skills, because of your history, your past experience. That means that when you perceive a particular tool, then there are all these other tools that are also referred to that you're ready for, that you're bodily ready to act on, which we think of in terms of states of action readiness. Unfortunately, the slide here is not working because you've got a whole side of it that's hidden from you. But there you can just see it says self-organizing states of action readiness. And the idea is that those are set up in the body by the field of relevant affordances because of the dynamics that have stabilized in your brain over time through a history of skilled engagement with the environment. So my closing slide is just to suggest that we can think of the horizon of associations that Hayden describes so beautifully and as a phenomenological concept, which we can then bridge to 4E cognition using this idea of multiple states of affordance-related action readiness that form in the whole body because of past history of engagement. So Hayden talks about the horizon in terms of habits of expectation, and sometimes Husserl and Merleau-Ponty will talk about these habits of expectation in terms of a anticipation fulfillment structure, which Matthew Ratcliffe would say orients you in a space of significant possibilities. And that's an excellent phenomenological description, but we can take that notion of an anticipation fulfillment structure as a phenomenological structure of experience, and we can then give a bridging concept which helps us to see how to take that phenomenological concept and connect it to concepts in 4E cognition. And that bridging concept is the concept of multiple states of affordance-related action readiness. That's what we call skilled intentionality. So these states of action readiness are simultaneously affective and behavioral, which means that they can capture both the intersubjective dimension of the horizon, because that's all a part of what you're ready to do in a particular context, how you're ready to engage with your interlocutor, for instance, and how they're ready to engage with you. But it can also capture the affective dimensions of the horizon. So in the example of Tim, the emotional history that Hayden and Tim share, which is elicited when Hayden hears the name and immediately smiles because he's going to get to talk to his brother who he hasn't seen for a long time. And this is all happening in the body in terms of the action readiness. And that action readiness is, in this case, social affordance related action readiness. I see Eros is here. He has a lovely paper that he's published recently on social affordances. So yeah, I think that there's resources here to think about the interpersonal, the social dimension of the horizon that is evoked when you hear a word. So my suggestion is that skilled intentionality can give us a whole rich set of resources for bridging this notion of weak imagination, outer horizon, to 4E cognitive science. But that would mean not looking to the brain, but looking to this wider, whole, living human being in a rich landscape of affordances. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Hayden, there are like very few minutes for your reply. But
yeah, of course.
We're gonna open for questions afterwards. If you have a question, please type on the chat, and then I'm gonna register your name here and call you afterwards. Okay, please, Hayden.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just respond very briefly then. First by saying, Julian, thank you so much for thinking through this and seeing how we could incorporate some of the work I've been doing, primarily more phenomenological, with the skilled intentionality framework. And there's a lot for me to think about there and kind of pointing a way forward. So I really appreciate that. I just want to close with one follow-up question, which is, you've kind of shown us how we would integrate the notion of horizon with the rich landscape of affordances in kind of a general way. And for the specific case of perception and action. Now, do you think that thinking about the horizon or any of the other discussions I've advanced help with the scaling up problem beyond just the phenomenological discussion? But do you think that the connection will also carry over to something like language specifically? Does it add anything to the discussion of thought or language from the affordance ecological psychology perspective, or are you kind of in the same place as before there?
No, we are able to take big steps thanks to your paper. Now, particularly the idea of thinking as a tool for imagining. I love that. But I think the key thing is to try the scaling up problem is about non-representational post-cognitivist conceptual frameworks for cognitive science. So what's key, I think, is not to look inside of the head, but to situate these tools for imagining in the environment. You said at one point that you thought that the phenomenology was neutral on the cognitive science explanation. I think it's not. I think it's a constraint on explanation in cognitive science, actually, and that representationist and cognitivist explanations are going to find it very difficult to cohere with phenomenological ideas, in that they take the subject out of its involvement and its concern with a meaningful environment, and then they try to reconstruct that meaning out of representations and computations over those representations. And they run immediately into what Dreyfus describes as the relevance problem, the common sense knowledge problem. And I think that's all hopeless. It's a dead end, exactly as Dreyfus thought. And the way out of that dead end is actually to look to the phenomenological tradition, because in everyday experience, we don't have a relevance problem or a common sense knowledge problem, because we're in the world, we're involved with it. The world is meaningful to us. So yeah, I think you were wrong to say that phenomenology is toothless when it comes to deciding these debates in philosophy of cognitive science. I think actually it strongly supports a non-representational post-cognitivist position.
I'll just follow up very briefly. I know we've got to move on, but I said logically consistent with different positions.
Okay.
And I did say that I think it makes a natural bedfellow with the kind of, for some of the reasons you suggested. But you're suggesting a stronger kind of constraint than I was acknowledging, and you provide some good reasons for that. So thanks, Julian.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to mute myself so we can let other people come in.
If you have a question, anyone would like to type your name here and I will let you speak. While we wait, I would like to confess, Hayden, that I don't easily see your proposal as a bridge. Honestly, I really find it hard to follow. And I was hoping you could give me, you know, go in this direction and start looking at it in this way, and then this would make my head turn a little, and then I would understand better.
Well, I guess the first thing I'll ask is it the specific proposal that I've advanced here that you're having a hard time seeing how it's going to advance any discussions in the cognitive sciences? Or is it the more general strategy of incorporating kind of phenomenological description and cognitive science research? Because I know some people are either just not familiar with that style of approaching work in the cognitive sciences, or maybe resistant to it for one reason or another. So is it just kind of the general style that you're not seeing the appeal of, or is it something about my specific proposal that?
It might be the general style. Well, when I think Inês mentioned that it is, if you understand words and action and perception in the same structure of horizons, you're gonna have all in the same, you know, they are all the same, from the same nature, and then you don't have the problem of the scaling up anymore. But I fail to see what are going to be the consequences of this, and is, I think, especially in empirical investigation.
Yeah, so I guess the attraction will largely be there for people who are dealing with the kind of problems that I'm trying to respond to, like the scaling up problem for embodied cognitive science, and I'm hoping that the phenomenological descriptions and analyses that I'm advancing will point a direction for the empirical research in ways that someone like Julian is a bit better positioned to work out kind of concretely. As we saw in his brief presentation, he can use the kind of descriptions that I give to say, oh yeah, and now here's how this is going to cash out in terms of the empirical research. And that's exactly what I was hoping as a person who primarily works in phenomenology but has an interest in the cognitive sciences. I'm hoping that people who work in that kind of style and field will be able to take up those primarily phenomenological descriptions and then extend them in the way that that Julian showed, at least as kind of a proof of concept, is, I think, possible. So yeah, this kind of responding to the scaling up problem and developing more comprehensive and global embodied and enactive approaches to cognition is what I'm hoping the appeal and kind of consequence and payoff of this work will be.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Jasper.
Yes, thank you. So I have a question about the transparency of language that you talked about. So you made I won't be talking about the hockey stick because I've never used one, but I did use a hammer. So we'll use the hammer as an example, and so I can sort of see how the hammer becomes sort of transparent, and you're focused on hammering. But I'm not quite sure if it really translates to the language case. So it seems that in the language case, what you're doing is you're still listening to the person talking, even though you also, in a sense, listen to what they are saying beyond the contingent embodiment of what they are saying. It is only through hearing those words as those words that you have access to what is expressed. And I think, especially if you start from
Jasper, we lost you.
Your microphone is off, Jasper.
oh, sorry, is it back?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh yeah. My battery is almost gone, so I'll just leave it at that, and then I can still hear your answer.
Yeah, great. So asking whether that kind of analogy of transparency holds, as I've claimed it does. I think you're right. You might be right that closer phenomenological descriptions are required here than what I've given so far. And it might be the case that we need, so a couple of things to direct attention to here. One, we need to talk about different levels of expertise here with language, and for that matter, with hammers. Because the first few times that you hammer, you really are paying attention to both the hammer and the nail and the piece of wood. And then eventually, as you get better at it, you're able to direct your attention more and more towards what you're trying to achieve, rather than focusing on using the tool itself in the kind of first execution of that task. So we can talk about kind of degrees of transparency of the tool, depending on our corresponding degree of expertise. And so that might transfer over to language as well. And depending on how well I'm understanding what's being said to me, I may be more with what's being talked about, and I may be less with the words, the language itself. And if my expertise is a little bit lower, then I might be more with the words and struggling to get through them to the thing I want to direct my attention to. And something in this context that I didn't mention in the paper, but that I have a lot of experience with, and I suspect probably everyone here has a lot of experience with, is operating in second languages. And a lot of the time when you're operating in second language, you do find yourself getting hung up on the words more and focusing more on the words themselves, and not being able to achieve that transparency in order to get to what's being said, or you're fumbling and you're going back and forth between the two. So I think like closer phenomenological descriptions are required here to explore to what extent that analogy holds, and maybe to get some finer descriptions in there as well. But maybe if I could use as a kind of paradigm case, something like I'm using my hammer and someone's giving me instructions about what to do. If the language is pretty simple and I understand what they're telling me to do, I'm, say, following their instructions, and they're saying, okay, now take the nail and put it on the board and hammer it in. I would take that as kind of a paradigm case of the language being pretty transparent. I'm not really getting hung up on the words at all. I'm working through the language, and I'm just really focused on what we're talking about and what I'm trying to direct my attention to through language. But it might be a case where we need to think in terms of a dual or split attention. So maybe it doesn't become fully transparent. Maybe there's a dual attention going on there. And maybe there are cases when it's more and less transparent than others. But yeah, I think that needs to be described a little bit more carefully. And there might be some more intermediary cases, and maybe some analogies and disanalogies to the kind of paradigm case of successful tool use, and some interesting cases of breakdown in between, where tool use or language use breaks down. And we really do have to be attentive to what we want to be the translucent or transparent medium. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And nice to kind of see you finally. We've had some exchanges before, so nice to meet you, Jasper.
Thanks for that answer. Also, just a short thing, I put in the chat a link to a paper which I find very interesting, which does some work in this direction.
Yeah, I saw the link.
Paper by Peter Jones. It's interesting in this on this topic.
I'm gonna check it out. Thank you.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes and no more questions. If Inês wants to I think you finished before you wanted to, so if you just want to use our last minutes I think
I
that'd
would
be great.
definitely like to. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I'd just like to say something to wrap up. I'd like to say that I think there are two questions that are we are playing up with here, and they're quite relevant. One is the philosophical question, and the other one is the empirical question. And I think that what you are aiming for with your paper is to pursue the philosophical question. And I think you do a very good job doing that. So I would strongly recommend you to do that, to the extent that I think that the philosophical question that we are after here is about what is it to experience the engagement with a word and the engagement with a tool. Is it the same kind of experience? Are there parallels? Are there commonalities between these kind of engagement, right? That would be a very philosophical question that we cannot ask scientists to respond this for us. So that's what makes it a philosophical question. And then there's the empirical question, which is how does the brain activity allow for this experience to happen? Like, what is the contribute of the brain activity? That's why I think that you do such a great job, and a very much needed job, in exploring this from a philosophical perspective, which is very relevant to the extent that if philosophy and phenomenology should not be divorced from science, and they shouldn't, the same way around is true. So you do such a great job that you can, by showing that there is this sort of a similar experience that can be characterized in the same way, then you show that, well, scientists need to listen to this, need to listen to the experience of both words and engaging with objects in order to design their experiments better. So I would take that this to be the case, that there are like two different questions playing out here, and that I think that you do a very good job in showing that the commonalities between engaging with a word and engaging with a tool. And I'm really happy with your paper because of that. I don't think you need to worry that much in using like scientific evidence to show your point. I think you do it very brilliantly, and I think it's more of the other way around. They need to listen to you to design experiments. That's it.
Yeah, thanks, Inês. And that actually points the direction towards what's sometimes called a front-loaded phenomenology, where we use kind of phenomenological analyses to suggest directions of empirical research and quite concrete experimentation. Yeah, I've got more to say, but that was a great way to sum up and leave things. So I'll just say thanks so much for that. And I look forward to continued conversations. And I can't thank you guys enough